What is going, everyone? It's Caleb Lumity here, and today we are going to be talking about Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This, for a long time, has been my favorite Star Wars movie. I've always loved The Phantom Menace, especially because if you grew up around the time of The Phantom Menace like I did, there was just so much new Star Wars content. Not only did you have the movie, but you had tons of video games coming out, great video games at that. You had awesome figures, some of the best figures that had been produced at that time. I mean, you originally had the original retro vintage Star Wars collection, and then they had the Power of the Force, but then once it hit Power of the Jedi, that's when you really started to get some really detailed and awesome Star Wars figures. So when I was, a kid, around the time of this film, just the prequel era in general, it was such a great time because it was just a huge resurgence of Star Wars. Everything was Star Wars, and I'm very happy that my parents raised me to be a Star Wars nerd because I was able to enjoy the prequels, and I still have a lot of love for them to this day. And Episode 1 is my favorite. Episode 1 has a lot of things that I am very nostalgic for, a lot of things that I love, and it does a lot of things that I think are really fun, and it produced my favorite Star Wars character of all time, Darth Maul. And I always just love going back and watching this movie, There's definitely issues with The Phantom Menace. I'm not going to act like there's no issues with it. Jar Jar is probably the biggest glaring issue. However, I do understand the point of Jar Jar. I think that this movie probably would have been pretty dark without Jar Jar. And depending on what Lucas's original plans were for Jar Jar, there may have been another reason why he was in that. And we may talk about that in this video, get into a little bit of theories and what Jar Jar's plan maybe originally was supposed to be, because there's some interesting stuff around that. But overall, I still really like The Phantom Menace. There's a lot of good stuff here. Obviously, this is the start of all the prequels. This is when you start getting to know the young version of Obi-Wan Kenobi. You get to see his master, Qui-Gon Jinn, who is still a really well-done character. I really like him, especially because he doesn't really go along with the crowd when it comes to the Jedi. He kind of goes against the grain. He thinks for himself. He does not always agree with the Jedi Order. He makes it very clear that he is opposed to the way that the Jedi Order thinks about things, and he's willing to defy them and do his own thing, and that's actually why he's not a member of the Jedi Council. And I always thought that was really cool and always really interesting. And if it wasn't for Qui-Gon Jinn, you wouldn't have Anakin being brought to Coruscant to be trained to be a Jedi. Now, that being said, that you could also view that as a kind of a backfire in a way, considering what Anakin becomes later on. But it's still really cool to think that the whole reason Anakin got to Coruscant was because Qui-Gon Jinn found him on Tatooine. And I think that Qui-Gon's just a really interesting character, and even though he's a Jedi, there's still a little bit of gray to him. He does his own thing, and I like that. I've always liked that, and I've always really respected that character. And Liam Neeson does a fantastic job as Qui-Gon Jinn. In fact, I really wish we would have gotten to see more of him as Qui-Gon Jinn. I think that at this point it's probably a little bit too late. You could do Force Ghost stuff and stuff like that, but for the most part, obviously we're going to talk about spoilers in every single Star Wars video I do, so heads up, spoilers. Obviously, he's dead, but at the end of this, he dies by Darth Maul, so there's not really much more to do with that story, unfortunately, but I still was really interested in Qui-Gon, and I always liked that character quite a bit, and the relationship between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan Kenobi was really good as well. Qui-Gon obviously had a lot of faith in Obi-Wan. He really trusted his Padawan, and I think that's actually really cool that he had so much faith in him. And you kind of see the joking Obi-Wan in this a little bit. He tries to joke with Qui-Gon, but Qui-Gon is very... I would say Qui-Gon is a very kind of dry person. Even though I like Qui-Gon and I like his personality, you can tell he doesn't really do a lot of joking in this movie, except for when he needs a favor from Watto. That's the only time he really does any sort of kind of humor or anything like that. But still, I really like the characters. I like the interactions. The acting's really good. The casting was amazing for this movie. Just an amazing cast of characters. I love that Ray Park was the one who played Darth Maul in this. They had an actual stuntman as the Sith Lord, because it helped with one of the greatest fight scenes in Star Wars. I mean, the Duel of the Fates is still talked about today, and whenever you talk about the greatest Star Wars fights, Duel of the Fates will always be brought up. Darth Maul versus Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, that will always be brought up as one of the greatest fights in Star Wars history. I think the only one that really rivals it or may be better than it is Anakin versus Obi-Wan in Episode 3. That fight is also insanely good, but Duel of the Fates has held up so well. Now, let's talk about some things that haven't held up too well, shall we? The CGI, of course, is dated at this point, but I still don't really mind the CGI too much. There's points in it where the CGI looks great, and then there's other points where you see the CGI and you see the surroundings of some of these characters, especially when you see the Trade Federation, senators walking around, and you see them first land on Naboo, and you're looking at the scene, and you're just like, yeah, this is some rough CGI. But then you see the marching of the battle droids, and you're like, okay, this looks great. So it's definitely back and forth with the CGI. Not all of it has aged gracefully, but some of it has. Jar Jar is I used to like Jar Jar, I gotta be honest, and I actually like the Gungans as a race. I think the Gungans are a really fun race. I really like them, and I always like the idea of this underwater, city that they have, this underwater civilization, and seeing the actual waters of Naboo and all the creepy monsters in it. I always loved that, and I always thought that was really cool when I was a kid. And I still think it's really cool today, but Jar Jar definitely gets on my nerves a little bit more as an adult than he used to when I was a kid. But that being said, I still don't hate Jar Jar the way other people do. I'll still always have a little bit of nostalgia for Jar Jar. I think the actor went through a lot with him, and it's not the actor's fault. So I still like Jar Jar, though. I don't think he's terrible, but he grinds my gears a little bit more nowadays than he used to. And you also have Little Annie. I wouldn't say Little Annie's a bad thing. A lot of people didn't want to see the kid version of Anakin, but you have to start somewhere. You do have to start somewhere, and why not start at the very beginning? This explains Anakin's origin story of how he wasn't... There's no father. He was created by some sort of force manipulation, whether it was the Force itself or if it was Darth Plagueis or Darth Sidious, whoever it may be, something created Anakin that wasn't normal. And that storyline has been, interesting for so long, and there's so many theories around it that have just never been confirmed. We still don't know to this day exactly how Anakin was created, other than it was the Force. Whether it was the Force just doing it on its own, or someone manipulating the Force to create him, which is hinted in Episode 3, who knows? But I still think that this is one of the most interesting plot points to come from this movie, and it's been disrespected a little bit in some of the newer series, and we'll talk about one of those series in a later video coming up. But that being said, I still think that story point is very interesting, very important, especially if this all ties to Darth Plagueis. If it ties to Darth Sidious, then fine, whatever, But I feel like if this ties to Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious was actually just basically using Darth Plagueis' creation as basically a spite move, that almost makes the idea of Anakin being created by Darth Plagueis even more interesting. So, I don't know. I've always found that very interesting. I love that plot point. A lot of people don't like midichlorians when midichlorians first created. I always liked midichlorians because before midichlorians showed up, the whole Force was kind of viewed more as a religion than it was an actual scientific thing. But what midichlorians does is it does add a little bit of science into the Force. So it kind of makes, it not so whimsical and just, basically completely unexplainable, and you can just wave it away by just being like, oh, well, it's basically space magic. But now you can be like, oh, there's some science behind it in this universe, so that makes sense. So I've always liked that, and I always thought the idea of having a high midichlorian count to, find out who has ridiculously strong prospect to be a Jedi was always an interesting idea, and I still really like it to this day. And whenever I hear any series bring up midichlorians, from this point on, I always get excited about that. Now, one of the other things I really, really love about this movie is the pod racing. I cannot talk about this movie without the pod racing, how much the pod racing just meant to me. I loved pod racing. I always wanted the pod racers when I was a kid. I would go buy the figures of Team Topagules, and I would buy Dud Bolt and all of them. I just loved having those figures, and the pod racing has still aged so well. It looks great. It's so much fun to watch. Just the aliens that are participating in it. You get so many new species of aliens in this movie. So many great ones. You get a return of Jabba the Hutt to oversee the pod race and stuff. And I've just always loved the action-packed nature of the pod race. I've always loved Sebulba being slimy and cheating, and, Anakin trying to basically overcome the odds by beating this guy who's literally cheating to destroy the other pod racers. And there's just so much cool stuff around the pod race in general. Even just some, like I said, some of the characters that you see around the pod race that aren't even involved. Seeing the Tusken Raiders shoot at Team Topagales and stuff while he's just trying to avoid getting shot. Seeing you also get to see Aurra Sing at one point, and Aurra Sing's kind of like, I see a lot of people say Aurra Sing is the Boba Fett of the prequel trilogy, and I kind of agree with that. Aurra Sing doesn't really do anything, but there's a presence there, and that presence was always pretty strong. You saw her, and you're like, what is her backstory? Like, she's, just by seeing her, that was good storytelling, because you knew that there was more to that character than just what she appeared. So, always really found that interesting. You kind of always wondered if she was there just watching the race, or if she was actually there to maybe target someone eventually, but, you never really know. You never find out. So, she's one of those mysterious characters that you always wanted to know more about, like Boba Fett was. So, I always like that as well. But the pod racing is amazing in this. And, of course, I gotta talk about the CIS. I always loved the CIS, the droid army. I always thought they were really cool. And the Neimoidians that, control them in the Trade Federation, I always really thought they were cool as well. And I loved the spaceship designs in this. When you see some of the ship designs, they are amazing. I absolutely love them. I think they look great. And even in the final battle, when you see Anakin, take a Naboo fighter and fly into one of these space stations and actually destroy it from the inside, I love that scene. Even though now this pod racing line isn't great, I still really enjoy that scene because I just love the space battles. I love the way that everything looks in this, and I just think overall the design of this movie, the setting of this movie, and just every bit of the way that this movie looks is really fun for Star Wars. Not all the CGI holds up, but just the setting in general and the design, it feels like Star Wars. And this was, I think, a natural way to go for the Star Wars series. So I still really love Episode 1. And I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for Star Wars Episode 1. Now, that being said, let's talk about Jar Jar, Darth Jar Jar. Okay, let's talk about the Jar Jar Star Wars Sith Lord theory, alright? So, yeah, this is a theory that's been going around for a while. It's been around for years at this point. I remember seeing the first video of it, and I thought it was kind of a joke. And then once you start watching it, things start seeming like, oh, maybe this was the original idea, especially when you hear some of, the original, George Lucas interviews where he says or when he says Jar Jar is the key to all of this, and you're just like, wait a minute, George, what are you saying right now? Because, he had a big emphasis on Jar Jar. Now, saying Jar Jar is the key to all of this could mean multiple things. He could have meant this is the key to make things not so dark. So, because this movie would be very dark without Jar Jar Binks, There's the Jedi Master gets killed, and it's a really intense scene, and there's just a lot of other stuff that, Jar Jar kind of lightens the mood for. However, saying he's the key to all of this does definitely sound like there was more planned to him than what originally is there. And we know that George loves the idea of the inconspicuous, clumsy character secretly being some sort of powerful character instead. We saw it with Yoda, so it makes sense that he would do this with the other side and do this with a Sith. And we still see this trope happen in Star Wars to this day. So it doesn't really surprise me, and it wouldn't surprise me if this was the original idea. You do see at points what looks like Jar Jar talking to Qui-Gon and kind of waving his hand, hoping to force trick him and stuff. You do also see him mouthing the same exact words that Padme is saying at one point, literally talking, and you can see her say, "Well, I don't approve." And Jar Jar is saying, "I don't approve" at the same exact time right behind her. But he's trying to hide behind a corner and say it, and it just makes you wonder. It's just these can't be coincidences, can they? Why would you animate? Because, yeah, remember, he's CGI. So they had to CGI in Jar Jar saying these things behind Padme and mouthing the exact same words that Padme is. So there had to be some sort of reason for this. And it does kind of make you wonder, what was the point here? So, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think below. I think it's kind of an interesting theory. Is it true that Jar Jar Binks is a Sith Lord? I don't know. It's not anymore, because I don't think it will ever become part of canon. But was that the original idea? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this, because I think it's possible that was the original plan, and Lucas got cold feet about it and was just like, okay, we got way too negative of a reception about Jar Jar. It's time to pull back. It's possible that Jar Jar could have been the original Darth Plagueis. I'm glad he's not, but it could have been. It seriously could have been. And if they somehow made even Jar Jar at this point a Sith Lord in a different way, I don't know if I would be mad about it, honestly. I would be like, you know what? It makes sense. I saw what he was doing in episode 1, so if you make him Sith Lord, fine. Just don't make him Plagueis. Leave Darth Plagueis alone. I think at this point, Darth Plagueis is pretty well established to be a Mun and everything, so we don't really have to worry about them messing with his lore or anything. But if they want to make Jar Jar a Sith Lord still, I'm not going to say I'm against it. But I'll leave this video there. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Go check out Star Wars The Phantom Menace. I'm sure everyone watching this already has, but it's always fun to talk about it with other Star Wars fans, so why not talk about it together? And we'll talk about more Star Wars in the future. So I'll talk to you next time. You have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.